Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Muscle and Mind podcast, where we discuss how to build a better body and brain so we can perform at our best in work, life, and play. In today's episode, I wanted to give you guys a breakdown of what I believe to be the top 10 most important exercises that you should be doing in the gym on a weekly basis. So, the way I actually came up with this idea for the episode was I love watching survival shows. And in these survival shows, what happens is they get put on some deserted island for 2 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever it is. And they get told that they can pick 3 things to keep with them for that entire time. Now, some people pick cups to carry water, some people carry knives, some people make fishing nets, some people bring things to create shelter. And essentially, they pick the most important elements they believe they need to survive in the wild for that time. So that was my inspiration for today's episode, and that's exactly what I've done with these exercises. I'm going to share with you the top 10 most important exercises to incorporate on a weekly basis for strength, endurance, overall fitness, and essentially building a stronger body. So, as we go through this today, what we're going to be covering is we're going to break down each of the exercises in terms of the movement pattern, the joints that they cover, so the joints that are involved in that movement, the muscles that are engaged, and of course, the regressions for those exercises. And by regression, what I mean are other versions or different variations of that exercise that you can use if you do not have the skill or the ability to perform the core exercises that we're going to be discussing here. So let's get straight into it. Coming in at number 1, the barbell deadlift. Now, the deadlift as a whole is the OG of strength training exercises. When we're performing the deadlift, we are lifting a load from the ground up to a standing position. Arguably, one of the most functional things that we can actually do in the gym. Literally bending down and picking up something heavy off the ground. So when we're talking about the barbell deadlift itself is the exercise. And I've chosen the barbell deadlift because it is the best way to load what we call the hinge movement pattern. So the hinge movement pattern is literally the epitome of a deadlift. It's bending forward, leaning our upper body down with a slight bend of the knees and lifting something up off the ground. Now, a little bit later, we're going to cover the regressions, so the other versions of the deadlift that you can do that follow the same movement pattern. But ultimately, the deadlift is a hinging movement. The reason I've chosen the barbell deadlift is because it is a movement in the hinge pattern frame that we can load with a lot of weight. Now, don't get me wrong, you don't have to be using a ton of weight to do this, but when we look at something that is scalable, meaning something we can keep adding weight and repetitions to over time, the barbell deadlift is the king of all kings when it comes to the hinge movement. So that is why the barbell deadlift is coming in at number 1. Loading that hinge movement up and essentially having as much space as we could really ask for in terms of growth. And what I mean by that is adding more and more weight onto the bar as we get stronger and as we develop our fitness. Now, when it comes to the joints covered in the barbell deadlift, obviously we have engagement of the hips as we push those hips back as we lower and push the hips forward as we rise up. We've got activation of the knee, the ankle, and the spine. So we're really covering a lot of the key joints when we're moving through that barbell deadlift. In terms of the muscles worked, this is one of the things that makes the barbell deadlift such an incredible choice. And to be honest, probably the top reason that it is in the number 1 position. When we look at the muscles that are trained when we work the deadlift, we have the glutes, the hamstrings, the quadriceps. Now, the quadriceps can be more or less engaged depending on how you do the movement, but overall the quadriceps are being worked. And even the calves to an extent as we are pulling off the ground. So before we look at the other muscles that are actually involved in the deadlift, because there are more, it's amazing to see how already most of the muscles of the lower body are engaged just by this one movement. And guys, remember, as we go through today, we've picked these 10 exercises. And the reason that we have picked these specific 10 is that they challenge the body in all of their movement patterns and all of the muscles are engaged. What we're looking for is the biggest bang for our buck, meaning the best result, the most work completed for the shortest amount of time. And the reason that's so powerful is that a lot of the time we get caught up and overwhelmed in the amount of exercises that are out there, right? It can become so overwhelming because there's so many different exercises available. But when we really break it down and we look at what are the exercises that are going to give us the best results for our time, our effort, and our energy on the gym floor, these are the keys because they cover a lot of the joints of the body, they implement all the main movement patterns, and they hit as many muscles as we can in each movement. So, with that being said, going back to the muscles of the barbell deadlift, not only do we have the glutes, the hamstrings, and the quadriceps involved, we also have the erector spinae, which are the muscles that run up the lower back, essentially the lower back muscles. We are also engaging the lats, right, the latissimus dorsi, and the trapezius. On top of that, we've got engagement of the rear deltoids, right, to stabilize and fix our shoulders into position, as well as the core as a whole. Now, we've mentioned the erector spinae, which are the muscles on the lower back, which are indeed part of the core. But when we perform a deadlift, we also have a lot of activation of our rectus abdominis, which are the abs on the front of the core, as well as the transverse abdominis and the obliques. So essentially, to make it easy, all core muscles are engaged because it is such a big compound movement that involves a lot of force and a lot of stabilization of the spine. And essentially, we are working the whole rear kinetic chain, which are all the muscles that run up the back of our body. Now, this is particularly important when it comes firstly to people who are normally sedentary, right? If we're sitting in a chair all day, like I am right now, if you're hunched over, for those of you listening, I am hunching my shoulders forward, rounding my upper back. When we're in that position a lot, those muscles and those joints tend to get weaker because they're in that stretched out position for so many hours of the day. So strengthening that rear kinetic chain using something like the barbell deadlift is a beautiful tool to improve posture, to strengthen those muscles, and not only to perform better in daily life, but also to avoid any injury or pain in those regions as we get older. So, last but not least, what are the regressions that we can do when it comes to the barbell deadlift? Now, for many, the barbell deadlift may be quite an intimidating motion or exercise to perform. So let's look at some ways that we can regress the barbell deadlift so that it is accessible to everyone who is doing it. Now, the very first thing that we can do to make sure that it is an easier version of the exercise is simply to reduce the range of motion. And what I mean by that is that instead of pulling all the way from the floor, we simply take the barbell, maybe put some boxes or some steps under each of the plates, and we raise that bar so that when we are pulling, we are not pulling through the full range of motion. Now, let's make one thing clear. The goal is not to stay there. The goal is to go for the full deadlift over time. But the challenge we might find, especially with clients or with people that have poor mobility, is that upper back starts to round, the lower back starts to round, and we kind of end up having this hunched over shell-like shape. We've all seen people in the gym doing this, right? They do a deadlift, it looks like they're Quasimodo with their back hunched over. You cringe and you pray for the vertebrae in their spine. That's not what we want. But instead of saying, okay, you can't have a perfectly flat back, therefore you shouldn't do the barbell deadlift, we give them a regression, right? We do a regression for ourselves so that the bar is a little higher. And when that bar is a little higher, we are going to be in a much better position to maintain a neutral spine and perform the movement properly. So the very first thing we can do is to reduce the range of motion. The second variation or regression that we can do is we can use a kettlebell or a single dumbbell deadlift. Now the key here is that it is single. Now the reason why this helps so much is when we perform a barbell deadlift, we're using both hands and our shoulders are externally rotated so that we can grip the bar. The challenge with that is that when the shoulders and the arms are externally rotated like this, what happens is it makes it very hard to actually lock the shoulders down. And if you are listening to this and not watching, I'm placing my chest up, locking my shoulders down. It's very hard to do that when our hands are faced outwards. To fix this, or to overcome this challenge, using a single object, whether it's a kettlebell or a dumbbell, and holding it with our hands in a neutral position, meaning our hands facing one another. This is going to help us rotate the shoulders back in and maintain a nice flat upper back where the shoulders are locked down, the scapula is pulled back, and everything is in alignment. So the single object, single kettlebell, single dumbbell deadlift is going to be an amazing regression and a way to build up to that barbell deadlift over time. And team, that's really the overall understanding I want you to get when it comes to regressions. They are simply easier variations of an exercise that follow the same movement pattern. So for example, here when we talk about the reduced range of motion, obviously that's our normal deadlift. But when we look at the single object deadlift, it's a different exercise, but it still follows the same movement pattern, that hinge movement pattern. And the goal is to get yourself or get a client really good at the regressed version. And once you build up strength and fitness in that version, you can then move to a more complicated or advanced movement, which in this case would be the barbell deadlift. Now, just for the deadlift, as well as all the rest of the exercises we're going to discuss, I'm going to be sharing 2 variations or regressions with you in today's episode, but there are other variations you can do. So you are not limited to these. These are just what I found to be most effective for myself and for the clients that I've worked with. So number 1, the barbell deadlift. Yes, the OG. Let's move on to number 2. In the number 2 spot, we've got the barbell squat. Now, the barbell squat is predominantly a lower body movement, but arguably, we could call this close to a full body movement. And that's because there's a lot of other muscles that are engaged when we are doing the barbell squat outside of just the lower body. So let's have a look at it. Firstly, a barbell squat is the exercise, but the movement pattern is a squat. Let me explain what that means. So the squat movement pattern is a basic human movement. It involves bending the knees and dropping the hips down as low as possible, and then exploding back up to a standing position. Now, what's quite interesting is when you look at prehistoric humans, we never really used to sit that much. When we were eating or when we were doing anything close to the ground or trying to rest, what we would do is we would squat. We would literally go down onto our haunches and sit in a squat. Very common movement pattern. However, I highly doubt that most of us spend our time sitting in a squat outside of the gym, right? So the squat is actually the movement pattern. The barbell squat is simply an exercise that represents that movement pattern. Now, the reason why the barbell squat is the king of all kings when it comes to the squat movement pattern is similar to the barbell deadlift. There's so much ability to grow and improve on that movement. And the reason is because you can constantly add weight and repetitions to that exercise. Now, I'm going to jump a bit ahead and then I will come back in a moment. But just to give you an example of this, one regression to the barbell squat would be the goblet squat. Now, a goblet squat is where you hold one implement, which is an object, in your hands in front of your chest. So for those of you listening, imagine you grab a dumbbell and you hold it nice and close to your chest with both hands. Now, we can do that movement, we can give that movement to our clients, and we can see progression, right? We can add weight, we can add repetitions. But what is going to limit us when it comes to that exercise? Well, after a period of time, as your legs, your lower body strengthens, what you're going to find is that what stops you, so what causes you to fail when you do that exercise, is not actually your legs, but your arms and your shoulders, because they are holding the object in front of you. Now, of course, our lower body, our legs are much stronger relative to our shoulders and our arms. So what you're going to find is going to happen is you're going to hit a point where you can no longer add any weight or reps because you're simply failing through your arms and your shoulders instead of your legs, which is pretty much destroying the whole point, right? Which is to mostly develop the lower body. So that is why a barbell deadlift I would consider to be the king when it comes to the squat movement pattern. Because when you've got that barbell on your back, it's a lot easier to hold that load. You can rest the barbell on your back. It's being supported by your shoulders, your upper back, your lower back, and the load is placed where it can be managed a lot better. Meaning we can go heavier and we can push ourselves further in the barbell squat. Now, as always, it's not to say that if you can't do the barbell squat that you're not going to get benefits. The point is that the barbell squat should be the goal. Unless you have some very specific condition or injury where you cannot do a barbell squat, we should all be aspiring to get to the point where we can at least do the barbell squat for a large portion of our training. And as applies to all of these exercises, it's not that you only have to do these exercises. It's that if we only had 10, if we were on that island for 2 weeks and you could only bring 10 things, in this case, these are the ones that I would pick. So, coming back around to the barbell squat, we know the movement pattern is a squat. We know now, well, we will know in a moment, that the joints engaged in the barbell squat are the hips, the knees, and the ankles. But a little bit earlier, we spoke about the fact that the barbell squat can arguably be considered a full body movement. And that's because not only are we engaging those joints as we move through, but we're engaging a lot of the rest of the body too. So for example, when it comes to the muscles worked by the barbell squat, of course we've got the quadriceps, the glutes, the hamstrings. This is obvious. These are the main movements, or the main muscles rather, that are getting us through the movement. But at the same time, you also have to engage your core to keep you in an upright position, to keep you stable, and to keep you balanced as you move through the barbell squat. On top of that, you also have to make sure that you are engaging your upper back and your shoulders so that you can squeeze backwards. If you're only listening and not watching, I have my hands up as if I'm holding barbell. I'm squeezing my upper back together, locking my shoulders down so that I can secure that barbell on my back. So because of all of these, we're engaging not only the legs, we're engaging the core, right? Which includes the rectus abdominis as well as the erector spinae. And we're actually engaging the upper back and the shoulders as well. Now, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't suggest you do a barbell squat to grow your upper body or your core. But the point is we're engaging those muscles. And remember, our goal here is to make sure that we are doing movements that give us the biggest bang for our buck. Not only in terms of working those muscles through their full range of motion, for example, using a shoulder press for the shoulders, but also to activate them where they have to stabilize and where they have to assist in other movements. So the barbell back squat, beautiful movement for the lower body, king of all lower body exercises when it comes to things like the quadriceps, and really great for stabilization of everything else too. The upper back, the shoulders, the core, the lower back. Now, we've already discussed the regressions when it comes to the barbell squat. We have the goblet squat, and a further regression from that would be your basic body weight squat. Now, what I would suggest is, especially for people, if you are new to training or you have a client who's new to training, really make sure that they are mastering the body weight squat first. Remember, you can think of regressions kind of like your ABCs, right? I can't expect you to write a book if you cannot write a chapter. You can't write a chapter if you can't write a paragraph. You can't write a paragraph if you can't write a sentence. You can't write a sentence if you can't write a word. And you can't write a word unless you can write the letters, your ABCs. And that's what regressions are. They are building blocks to higher levels of that particular exercise. But the regression must always be the same movement pattern as the exercise you're trying to build to. For example, the barbell squat, squat movement pattern, obviously. Goblet squat, squat movement. Body weight squat, squat movement. And to give you another example just off the bat here, if someone was really struggling with, for example, their lower back or just balance and coordination in general, doing something like a leg press would also mimic the squat movement. But in this case, you're locked in, your back is supported, which means the client or yourself can just focus purely on moving the hips and the knees through that range of motion, getting used to the squat movement, building up the muscles involved in the squat so that when the time comes to move on to a more advanced version, they already have some endurance in those muscles, some strength, and some coordination. All right, so We are 2 down, right? 2 down, 8 to go. Apologies for rubbing my nose here, just making sure that I keep everything in place. So, number 3. In the third spot, we've got the Bulgarian split squat. Now, if you know what a Bulgarian split squat is, you probably made some kind of disgusted face when I said it right now. And if you've done a Bulgarian split squat, you know that this is a killer exercise. Absolutely incredible movement, but very, very, very challenging. For those of you who don't know what a Bulgarian split squat is, think of it like a lunge, right? It actually is a form of a lunge. But instead of lunging with both feet on the ground, taking one step and then the next step, when you're performing a Bulgarian split squat, you have your back foot elevated on a bench or a box. The lead foot is placed firmly on the ground, and you are then dropping your knee and dropping your hips all the way down and coming back up. So in the Bulgarian split squat, you are working one leg at a time. So the Bulgarian split squat is a lunge pattern. Now the lunge movement is once again one of the fundamental movements of the human body. So far, we've gone through the squat, the hinge, which was our deadlift, and now the lunge. These 3 things, squat, hinge, and lunge, are movement patterns, right? They are fundamental ways that the human body can move. The exercises are simply one of many exercises that mimic that movement pattern. So in this case, when we're looking at the movement pattern that is the lunge, the Bulgarian split squat is the king of all kings of exercises when it comes to the lunge pattern. So your Bulgarian split squat, once again, similar to your squat, is going, and by the way, super weird that it's called Bulgarian split squat when it is in fact a lunge pattern. So I get it, no idea why that's the case. And for some reason, any exercise that is preceded by an Eastern European country tends to be very, very difficult. So that's not science, that's just some anecdote that I've picked up over time. Feel free to disagree with me in the comments, but if you've done any of these, I'm sure you will agree. So the joints that are engaged are the hips, the knees, and the ankles. The muscles that are worked are the quadriceps, the glutes, the hamstrings, the calves, and the core. Now, the core has to be engaged, and this is one of the reasons I love the Bulgarian split squat. Now, when you are on one leg, when you're using one limb, your core has to engage more than if you were on 2 feet. And the reason is because your core needs to keep you balanced. When you're on one leg, you are, by definition, slightly unbalanced because you are literally missing one of your foundational pieces, your other leg. So the core really has to engage in order to keep you balanced. Another reason why I absolutely love the Bulgarian split squat. Now, what's also great about this is that you can load this up, right? Meaning that there is almost endless possibility to load up, meaning to add weight to your Bulgarian split squat. That being said, what I would recommend is start off with your body weight. See if you can get to the point where you're getting anywhere from 3 to 4 sets of 12 to 15 reps with a really great technique. We're not going to talk too much about technique in today's episode, but in future episodes we will look at that. But the point is, start with your body weight, because trust me, even though this is a body weight exercise, it is a killer. So make sure that you advance your Bulgarian split squat with your body weight before you start adding weight. Now, when you want to add weight, there's a few ways that you can do it. The most common way is to use one dumbbell at a time and hold it in your hand. Now, there actually is a difference, slight difference in the way the exercise works depending on the hand you are using. So, if you are using the dumbbell, right, so you grab a dumbbell or a kettlebell, a weight for lack of a better term, when you're holding the weight, if you hold it in the same leg that is doing the work. So imagine I've got my right foot elevated on a bench, my left foot is planted on the ground, and now I grab the weight with my left hand. Doing it in this way is going to probably put a bit more tension on the working leg, but it's not going to have as much of an impact on the core stability. If you do the opposite, so my left leg's on the ground, my right leg is elevated, and now I take the weight into my right hand, this is going to still work the leg, of course, but it is really also going to create a little bit more of a unbalance, if that's even a real word, which is going to make the core engage even more. So you can play around with the hand placements. What I'd suggest, just hold the weight in the same hand as the leg that's working to begin with. Now, once again, you can imagine endless ways you can add weight. You can then add another dumbbell. So you've got dumbbells in both hands. Some people use a barbell on the back. Now, I'm not such a fan of this, just because it's quite dangerous to kind of get your foot on while you're holding the barbell. If you fail, it's quite dangerous because now you've got one leg down, you're a bit unbalanced. So yeah, it can work, but it's not my favorite way to do it. I prefer to use dumbbells or something of that nature. What's also really cool, what I've been experimenting with lately, is using a weight vest for these. Now the weight vest is great because you are now centering that weight over your core, right? So there's no balance from side to side. You're focusing that weight on your core, and essentially you're pretending that your body weighs more than it does. So I'd recommend doing the dumbbells or the kettlebell in the single hands, eventually moving on to the double hands. And if you do have a weight vest, a beautiful way to mix things up and add weight in that way. All right, so that is your Bulgarian split squat. Now, what about the regressions, right? What if we cannot or we are unable to perform a Bulgarian split squat? Now, just a note on that. Sometimes, most of the time, if we're not used to this, balance is going to be a challenge, right? You're going to be rocking all over the place, struggling to find your balance. So what you can do as a regression is to do a supported Bulgarian split squat, meaning that with whatever hand you have available, you are holding yourself for balance purposes and performing the movement. What you can also do if you're a PT, if you're working with a client, you can simply place a pole on the ground for your client to hold, or you can have your hand up as a support structure for them if they need to grab it, if they feel like they're going to fall, right? So great regression there. You can also simply do a basic lunge, whether it's a static lunge, meaning you've got 1 foot forward, 1 foot back, and you're lunging on one leg, or your basic walking lunge. But once again, working our way up to the skill and the ability level to do that Bulgarian split squat is going to be a game changer. Awesome. By the way, YouTube people over here, podcast people, I know you can only hear me, so this won't make sense for you. YouTube people, I'm looking at this camera here, which is why I'm not looking at you here, but I see you. I hope you're doing good today. So now we've covered 3 of these movements, right? Now, these movements have mostly targeted the lower body, right? They've mostly targeted the lower body. Now let's move on and let's have a look at some movements that we'd incorporate for the upper body. Coming in at number 4 is the dip. Now the dip, to be honest, probably my favorite upper body exercise. Now, the reason I love the dip, firstly, the movement pattern is a vertical push. You have your hands out and you are pushing down, meaning you are pushing in a vertical plane. Now, the vertical push is the movement pattern. The joints worked are the shoulders and the elbows. Now, one of the reasons I love the dip is because it challenges the shoulder in a really, really, really good way. Now, a lot of people say, oh, well, my shoulders hurt when I do dips. Now, admittedly, you should rather use a regression before moving on to a full dip. But ultimately, you want to be in a place where you are doing a full range of motion dip. Now, a full range of motion dip means going all the way down as low as you can into your shoulder pockets. Now, I used to have the same challenge, right? Especially when I was bodybuilding, I didn't used to do full range of motion dips because they really hurt my shoulders. But what I started to do in the last couple of years is perform my dips, right? Even at very low repetitions, but using that full range of motion. And what I found is that it's actually strengthened my shoulder joints, let alone my muscles. It's strengthened my shoulder joints really, really, really well, to the point where I can now do a larger range of motion on all of my pushing movements. So that is one of the reasons I love the dip, not just for the muscles it engages, but for what it does for the shoulder. Beautiful range of motion, getting deep into that shoulder pocket, and just such a healthy movement for the shoulders. Now, the muscles worked here are going to be your pectorals, of course. There's some variation in the way you can do dips to target more the triceps or the pecs, but for our purposes, remember, top 10 movements to cover all the basics. We're just going to do a strong, solid, regular dip. So we've got the pectorals, right? The chest, the triceps, the front deltoid, and the core. Now, the core is engaged as a stabilizer because as you are dipping, your core has to engage to maintain your body's straight position. Similar to the squat, to the deadlift, to the Bulgarian split squat, the core is not directly involved, but it is an amazing stabilizer. And once again, the more core activation we can get going on, the better. And last but not least, the regressions. So for the dips, the regressions would be a bench dip, where you have your hands on a bench and you perform a dip in that range. And in general, a supported or a reduced range of motion dip. Now, I'm not such a fan of a reduced range of motion dip unless someone is really got tight shoulders, sticky shoulders, not used to that range of motion. What I would suggest, if it's possible, is to do an assisted dip. Now, in some gyms, you're going to have an assisted dip machine, which essentially has a pad for your knees and you can adjust the weight. What's great about that is that you can get the motion of the dip, but without using your full body weight. As you get stronger, you can use less and less and less resistance until you're eventually using your own body weight. You can also do this with bands, meaning you can take a band, wrap it around a pole, place it under your knees, and work your way up like that, using a weaker and weaker band, because remember, the stronger the band, the easier the movement, and working up to your full dip in that way. So, number 4, the dip. Number 5, the pull-up, right? We've done a movement of the upper body doing a vertical push to engage a lot of the anterior, right? The frontal muscles. Now let's look at a movement for the rear side of the body, right? Now, this is a vertical pull. So notice we did a vertical push. Now we're doing a vertical pull. Now the pull-up is super simple, right? Firstly, it's a vertical pull movement. And essentially, you're going to grab a bar, you're going to hang at full extension, come all the way up until your chin goes over the bar, and then go all the way back down until your elbows are locked out. This is very important. Half range of motions are not going to cut it. Full extension of the elbows and get that chin up above the bar, right? Full range of motion here. The joints, once again, we're going to have the elbow joint that's working, and we're going to have that shoulder joint. Now, we're going to talk about the shoulder joint a lot as we go through this because the shoulder joint is such a complicated joint. It can do so many different things. So to keep it strong and healthy, we really want to take it through its full range of motion in different planes. We've just done a vertical push. Now we're doing a vertical pull, using that full range of motion, full extension, full flexion, all the way to the top. Now, the muscles worked. The latissimus dorsi, the lats, the biceps, the trapezius, the rhomboids, and the core. Why the core? For the same reason as the dip, to make sure that our body is straight, keeping us stable, keeping us secure, so that we're not swinging back and forward. So all these little core stabilization exercises add up over time. So this is the pull-up. Now let's look at some exercise regressions, right? Now, for the vast majority of people, doing pull-ups is going to be exceptionally challenging. Ladies, specifically, doing a pull-up is going to be very challenging. Now, there's no other reason for that other than men tend to have a stronger and faster developing upper body. So when we look at the regressions for the pull-up, we really need to make sure that we hit home with this. Because if you are someone who cannot do one pull-up, that's okay. There are other exercises you can do to mimic that version, right, that movement pattern, to work your way up to that pull-up. Now, there's a few things you can do. Now, I'm actually going to give you 3 here. The first one is your standard pull down, right? So your pull down machine. Now, a pull down machine is literally just mimicking a pull up. You're going to grab that bar, pull it down towards your chest, and then release it back up. Now, my only advice here, and we're not going to go into too much detail on it, but my only advice here is that if you are trying to get your first or a few pull-ups, when you do your lat pull downs, do not do high repetitions. Do low repetitions between 1 and 5 reps with a very heavy weight, so that you get better at working in that rep range. The reason is that that rep range is going to develop that strength, not just size and endurance, but strength, which will then help you achieve your first full normal pull-up, or your first 2, 3, 4, or 5. So the lat pull down, beautiful way to start, cuts out a bit of the core engagement, the stabilization. Great movement. Now, I'm usually not too much of a fan of machines when it comes to fundamental movements like this, but the lat pull down is definitely one of those things you'd want to include to get to your first pull-up. Other versions, and this is what I'm much more of a fan of, are assisted pull-ups, very similar to your assisted dips, right? Either a pull-up machine. Usually your assisted dip machine and your assisted pull-up machine are the same thing. So an assisted pull-up machine is great. If you don't have that, you can do banded pull-ups, where once again you connect a band, you stand on the band with your feet, so that as you move up, it gives you a little bit of assistance as you move up. As you get stronger, you can use a lighter and lighter band. My pro tip on that is, gentlemen, be very careful of when that band comes up. Make sure that you are separated from the band completely before you let it shoot back up. You can fill in the blanks as to why. So that is the pull-up. All right, we are 5 down, 5 to go. Set up nice and tall, chest up, shoulders back. Yes, take a nice big deep breath in. Exhale, and let's keep on rolling. Coming in at number 6 is the barbell row. Now the barbell row is a horizontal pull. Now you'll notice with the dip and the pull-up, we've spoken about a vertical push and a vertical pull. Now we're going to look at a horizontal pull, which means pulling an implement towards your body, whereas your vertical pull was pulling something down or pulling your body up. So your horizontal pull is pulling something towards your belly button. Now, the joints engaged, we have the elbow, and would you know it, that good old shoulder joint. Once again, using that shoulder joint through a very unique range of motion, pulling up towards the body. Now, the muscles that we're going to work here are similar to the pull-ups. We're going to have engagement of the lats, the traps, the rhomboids, the biceps, the posterior deltoids, and that core. Now, this is actually a really good movement for the core. Just like the other movements we've discussed, the core was going to work as a stabilizer here. But the cool thing about this is because we're in a bent over position, right? So my barbell row, my knees are slightly bent, I'm bent over, almost like I'm about to do a deadlift. But instead of doing a deadlift, I just pull the bar to my chest, bringing my elbows back and squeezing behind and going back to full extension. Now the cool thing with the core here is that the core, especially the lower back and the rectus abdominis, have to be really engaged to maintain that bent over position, right? One tip that I could give you here, depending on how you're doing your workout split, your lower body, your lower back might be quite in pain or quite sore from doing your lower body day. So if you do find that to be the case, you may want to use some of the regressions for this movement if your lower back is starting to get really sore and you find that you're not actually fatiguing your lats, but your glutes are just vibrating, your legs are shaking because you're still recovering from your leg day. So just keep that in mind. With that being said, let's look at some of those variations. The first one is going to be a single arm dumbbell row. Now the reason this is great is that if you don't have the skill or the ability or the endurance in your legs to hold that bent over position, the single dumbbell row allows you to take one dumbbell and do the same movement, but use your opposite leg and arm to stabilize yourself so that you don't need to rely on the core or worry about the core or the legs giving out. You can just focus on working the upper back, so the lats, the rhomboids, the traps, the biceps, through that range of motion without worrying about those stabilizing muscles like the quads, the glutes, the hamstrings, and the lower back. Another beautiful variation of this, which I think is very underused, is an inverted row. Now, an inverted row Technically, I think it should be called an inverted pull-up, but we can debate that later. Now, an inverted row is literally, imagine you have a barbell, right, that's resting on two supports. You are lying underneath the barbell. So you're lying on your back, the barbell is directly above you, you're looking at it up top. You grab that barbell and you pull your body up to the barbell and then lower yourself back down again. It is a horizontal pull because you're pulling in the horizontal range of motion, getting your body all the way up and releasing all the way back down, right? Amazing way to actually build up to a full barbell row and even to support you on your pull-up efforts. If you have any concerns about that, what that looks like, just Google inverted row. You'll have a lot of tutorials there on how to get that done. By the way, when it comes to that inverted row, there's a lot of ways that you can also play with that to make it easier or harder. For example, the closer the legs are to the body, the easier it's going to be. The further away they are, the harder it's going to be. Coming in at number 7. Number 7, we have the incline dumbbell bench press. Now, here is where we get into a horizontal push. Notice we've done a vertical push, a vertical pull, and a horizontal pull. So, for both your pushing and pulling, you have horizontal and vertical. We are now going to look at a horizontal push. Now, the horizontal push can actually be done with many exercises. A barbell bench press that's flat, a barbell or dumbbell bench press decline. The reason I've picked the incline dumbbell bench press, there's a few reasons for it. Firstly, you're able to get a really good range of motion with the dumbbells, right? Because when you're in the incline position, you are able to bring those dumbbells all the way down to your chest, and realistically, what you should be doing is bringing them to your armpits. When you do that, you go much further than you could have gone with a barbell, so you get that full range of motion in the shoulders and the chest, and you are able to push back up. Once again, we're using the elbows and the shoulders, and we are pushing the shoulders through a large range of motion in that new angle. So think about what we've done for the shoulders so far. We've done the dips, getting that big vertical push. We've done the pull-up, getting that range of motion, the row, getting that range of motion, and now the incline dumbbell bench press, getting even different angles and range of motion on the shoulder joint. Combine all these together, and not only can you work the musculature around that, the back, the chest, shoulders, but the shoulder joint is also staying super healthy, super strong as it moves through its full range of motion. So, when it comes to the muscles of the incline dumbbell bench press, the reason I chose incline as well is that it still works your pecs, right? But it also works your front deltoid and your pectoralis minor, which is the upper chest, right? Sitting right on the top here near the collarbone. And that is why, on top of the range of motion, why I've selected this instead of a normal flat dumbbell or barbell bench press. Now, you also have involvement of the triceps here and the anterior deltoids, the front delt. Now, when it comes to the regressions, I just want to make it clear that I'm not against doing flat barbell or dumbbell or even decline presses. But the cool thing about the incline is, once again, you get to target more muscles and you get to have a greater range of motion, which is so critical to building strength, muscle, and overall health in those shoulders, or any muscle for that matter. So, in terms of the exercise regressions, we could simply switch to a flat dumbbell or barbell bench press. If the incline press is kind of niggly on the shoulders, someone's not really ready for that deep of a range of motion, going to a flat dumbbell press tends to take the pressure off of those shoulders, right? And last but not least, the push-up, right? Your standard push-up. Now, the push-up is great. We should usually start with the push-up just to build our way up. But the reason I didn't choose the push-up instead of the incline dumbbell press is that sometimes it's very challenging for people to do a push-up with their own body weight, particularly if they're quite heavy. The incline dumbbell press gives you the freedom to choose a weight that's appropriate for you, so you're not limited by your own body weight. All right, 7 down. Number 8, the Pallof cable twist. Now, what the hell is a Pallof cable twist? Now, a Pallof cable twist, rather, try to say that very quickly, is essentially where you grab a cable, you place it about chest height, and you attach a single handle to it. Now, if you can imagine me standing and the cable is to my right and the handle is to my right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab it and I'm going to have the cable in front of me. So I'm facing the cable now, and the cable is in front of me. I've pulled it back and there's some tension on it. Now I have my hands outstretched in front of me. I'm grabbing the cable. I've taken enough steps back that I can feel the tension. Now, with my feet square and my arms slightly locked out, right? Small bend is fine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to twist my body and rotate to the left, come slowly back and rotate to the right. Now, the movement pattern that's happening here is actually what we call anti-rotation, which means we are resisting rotation. Because as I move away, as I rotate away from the cable, it tries to pull me back to center. And when that happens, my core needs to engage to stop myself from being pulled back to the center. Now, this is such an amazing motion because we very seldomly do rotation-based exercises in our day-to-day life. This is why sometimes you can see someone who maybe even works out, maybe they do sport, but they injure their back when they were sitting on the couch twisting around to grab the remote or their cell phone, right? Something ridiculous like that. But the reason is because we often don't actually use that rotational movement. Now, the Pallof twist, once again, is an exercise for that movement pattern. But one of the reasons I love it so much is because not only does it engage the core, and not only does it actually go through this rotational movement, but it engages the shoulders too. The shoulders have to now stabilize and hold that handle in place and maintain that position all the way through, which for the shoulders, stabilization, as we've spoken about a lot, is really important, right? Not just for building big shoulders, but for also keeping those shoulders and those rotator cuffs, which are small muscles inside of the shoulder, healthy and strong. So in terms of the joints, we actually have the shoulder joint that's working, but we have the spine as well, right? When we rotate, we are rotating the spine. The muscles worked are going to be your obliques, your transverse abdominis, your rectus abdominis, and your shoulders, but primarily the core muscles because, they are being taken through their full range of motion. The shoulders are just there as a secondary. Now, in terms of an exercise regression, there are regressions and different variations of the Pallof twist that you can do. For example, bicycle crunches or Russian twists. But what I would suggest, because the Pallof press does not, Pallof twist, my mistake, does not really require that much skill, right? And there's usually not any reason why someone shouldn't do it. I wouldn't even recommend a regression. I would just recommend doing it at a very, very, very low resistance, right? So take that cable machine, put it on its lowest resistance, and just get used to that movement. Number 9, the hanging leg raise. Now, one of my favorite movements for the core, the hanging leg raise is going to involve hanging on a bar with your arms completely locked out and lifting your legs up in a straight path towards your chest. Now, you can sometimes tilt the hips a little bit at the end. Not 100% necessary, but you can do so. Now, the movement pattern is technically hip flexion, but you also are really engaging the spine and those joints to keep the body stable. In terms of the muscles that we are working, the rectus abdominis are going to be on fire here. Now, arguably, the hanging leg raise is one of the best exercises for the rectus abdominis, in other words, the ab muscles. You're also going to work things like the hip flexors, which are the little muscles at the top of your leg, as well as your obliques. But this is really the king of kings when it comes to the core and the rectus abdominis, the ab muscles. Now, I'm going to take you through the regressions and then I'll explain why the hanging leg raise specifically is so good. Some regressions, if you cannot do the hanging leg raise, is instead of hanging from a bar, you can actually use a pad. It pretty much looks like a chair with armrests. You grab onto the armrest and rest your elbows on the pads and then perform the leg raise like that. It basically takes out the grip element, right? So that your arms and your forearms aren't giving out before your core. Another really good regression, probably the best place to start, is going to be a lying leg raise, where you lie flat on the floor and you simply keep your legs straight, lift them all the way up, lift them all the way down again. Now, why is a hanging leg raise superior to a lying leg raise? Well, because when you're on the floor, as you lift your legs up, it actually becomes easier, right? Because at the top, if you imagine lying on your back with your legs directly to the ceiling, there's not really much tension on the abs, right? Because there's nothing pulling on them. Your legs are straight up, there's no tension on the abs. With a hanging leg raise, whether your legs are at the top or whether your legs are all the way at the bottom, gravity is pulling your legs down, which means your rectus abdominis have to engage to keep them up or keep them from falling. So the hanging leg raise specifically is the king of all kings, in my opinion, for the rectus abdominis. So last but not least, number 10, the barbell overhead press. Now, the barbell overhead press is also a vertical pushing motion. Now, you're going to engage that shoulder joint once again in a really healthy range of motion, pushing up overhead. Very functional movement if you have to push things up in the air, lift your bags, get something off of a high shelf. Very important for functionality. But when it comes to the overhead press, we are not only, because it's standing, right? This is the difference. We're not talking about a seated barbell or dumbbell press. We're talking about a standing barbell press. Now, the great thing about that is not only are you engaging the shoulders, you are also engaging the elbows, of course, but you're engaging the spine as well. The spine has to stabilize itself because you are doing it in a standing position, particularly when you are reaching overhead with your limbs extended. The spine and the core have to work even harder to stabilize yourself because now you've spread the load out so far away from the center. And this is why when we talk about the barbell overhead press, of course, the main muscle involved is going to be the deltoids, right? The shoulders. But you're also going to get amazing involvement of the core and the upper back because they are really going to be important for stabilizing the body because you're doing it from a standing position instead of a seated position. And that is why I'm such a big fan of the barbell overhead standing press. Another word for this is a military press, because you get that activation of the shoulders, but you also are building such good core stability. You're even engaging your glutes to keep your legs planted. Just a beautiful overall movement. Once again, kind of similar to that barbell squat. Yes, the overhead press is mostly for the shoulders, but you're engaging other muscles as stabilizers. So particularly for people who are sedentary or who sit a lot, doing your presses standing is going to be an amazing addition, not only for the shoulders, but for the core, the spine, the glutes, and all of those stabilizing muscles. Now, in terms of exercise regressions here, what you can do is do a standing dumbbell press. Sometimes it can be a bit easier to work with multiple weights instead of one if someone's a bit cautious or nervous of lifting a big bar over their head, right? With a dumbbell, it's much easier and safer to maintain that posture. And what I love the most, and this is usually what I would start every client on before I even attempt to do a standing barbell press, is a standing one-arm supported dumbbell press, which means they are standing feet shoulder width apart. The one dumbbell is in their hand, usually with the palm facing their cheek, right? Because this makes it a bit easier to press. And the other hand is grabbing a pole or some sort of support so that they can support the rest of their body as they do that one-arm press. So would definitely recommend starting with that one-arm dumbbell press, then moving to the two-arm dumbbell press, and then to the barbell press. All of these standing. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a time and place to do seated movements, but remember, these are the top 10 movements that we would pick if we could only pick these movements. All right, so we've been through a lot. We've tackled the top 10 movements that I would choose if they were the only ones I could choose for the rest of my life. Doing these movements, and if you do these movements, you will work every major joint in the body, every major muscle in the body, and effectively you will get the best result for your efforts. Now, if I look at my own training, if I look at the training I've given my clients, I always incorporate some version of these movements based on their fitness level. Now, there's nothing wrong with including other movements, but these are really the bread and butter. And to be honest, if you had to stick with just these 10 movements and apply the basic principles of progressive overload, recovery, and good technique, you would get amazing results. And as a final note, these 10 are the ones I'd pick if I couldn't choose any others. But even in a world where I am not on a deserted island and I can pick as many exercises that I would want, I would still always choose these because these are going to give me the best effect for my time. Our time is precious, our energy is precious. Don't get confused, don't get overwhelmed by all the nonsense out there about different exercises and random boozoo ball, half one-legged squat with a shoulder press kind of nonsense. Stick to the basics, do the basics really well, and you will get rewards, right? Simple is best. Advanced training is basic training done properly. Stick to these movements, follow the basic principles of fitness, and you will see amazing results in the gym. Team, thank you so much for joining me today on this episode of the Muscle and Mind podcast. We will be back very soon with further episodes on everything from exercise technique, nutrition, mindset, emotional intelligence, and more, so that we can build better bodies and brains, so we can crush life. Yeah, we can show up, we can get our shit done, and we can perform at our best. So thank you very much, and until next time, keep well, keep going, and keep growing.